Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. This is episode 11 of Talking Politics with me, Dr. Brian Baker. I'm really excited about this one because this week has been very interesting. We've had some major Supreme Court decisions, and in particular, we want to look at the one about birthright citizenship. I think that this is one that shouldn't have been nearly as close as it actually was when we think about the decision. But before we dive into their decision, I think it's important for us to understand how do we get to the place where there was even a question about whether people born in this country, once they're born here, being U.S. citizens. We thought that this was pretty straightforward, plain language when you look at the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, but apparently there are some who think otherwise. And I think it's important for us to go back to the original text of the 14th Amendment, and let's just look at what it says before we get into the executive order that came out last year trying to challenge birthright citizenship. And then we can talk a little about the decision itself, how many people were not in favor necessarily of going along with the Constitution, in my view. Now, let's look at this here. So the 14th Amendment, if you have not gone to constitution.congress.gov, if you go to the Library of Congress, you can find the Constitution of the United States. In particular, we're going to look at the 14th Amendment. Okay, now I'm going to read in section 1 of the 14th Amendment, I'm going to read what it says. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Okay. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. All right. So if you've heard these terms of the equal protection clause, if you talk to someone and they said, hey, this idea of making sure that people aren't deprived of due process, this is where it's coming from when we look at the 14th Amendment. But we specifically want to zone in on the first sentence of section 1 of the 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Now, I don't know about you. I'm not a lawyer. I never went to law school. I didn't get a doctorate in law, but I think that it's pretty plain language when you look at it. I mean, it could be me, probably not, but it could be me when I read this, all persons. So let's just stop there. Let that rest for a minute. All persons born or naturalized in the United States. To me, when I read that, it means all people. Doesn't matter where you're from. Doesn't matter, your background. It doesn't talk about race. Doesn't talk about ethnicity. It doesn't talk about the country that you came from. It says all persons born or naturalized in the United States, because there are a lot of people who become naturalized citizens of the United States. But all persons born here are citizens of the United States. Now, the last time I checked, all means all, persons means persons, and if they are born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Now, some would argue, well, what does that mean exactly? Subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Jurisdiction, right? Okay. Well, we'll come back to that in just a second. If everyone who's born here, and it's been the law of the land for, since the 14th Amendment was ratified more than 100 years ago, if that's been the law of the land, everyone who's born here, they're a citizen. Then why is it that there was a need for the Supreme Court to even have a case brought to them eventually about birthright citizenship? Why was that even a thing to begin with? So we have to go back to January 20th of 2025 last year, As we all know, President Donald Trump was elected back in November of 2024. He's inaugurated on January 20th of 2025, and he issues an executive order. All right. An executive order is not legislation passed by Congress. It is an executive order. And the president does have the right to issue executive orders. Doesn't mean that it will pass the muster of being lawful, but they can pass, any president can pass an executive order and says, this is going to be what we're going to do moving forward, unless it gets challenged in court, and it can be struck down by the Supreme Court, or the U.S. Congress could also pass a law as well, which is really what's supposed to happen. For those who may not know this, the U.S. Congress, when we talk about the House of Representatives and the Senate, those individuals in Congress, they're the ones who are responsible for enacting legislation. They're the ones who write laws, not the president. President's not responsible for writing laws. The executive branch is not the part of government that is supposed to be writing laws. Now, the executive branch does have some power to issue executive orders, directives, and things like that. But if those orders are not lawful, they don't actually, stand in line with the Constitution and things like that, then it can be challenged. That executive order can be challenged, and eventually it will make its way over to the Supreme Court, depending on the situation. Because we have, again, three branches of government. We have the executive branch, we have the legislative branch, right? And we have the judicial branch. The judicial branch, when we talk about the Supreme Court, this is the whole tripart system of our government where there are checks, or let me say, there's supposed to be checks and balances. Checks and balances to make sure that if the executive overreaches, that the other two branches will say, hold up, Mr. President, hold up, Madam President. Maybe one day we can hope for that you're doing too much. Going to put this in plain language. You're doing too much, and what you're trying to do is not lawful. And we're going to have to rein you in so that we don't have a monarchy. All right. We don't want to have a monarchy. We want to have a democratic republic where, okay, we elected the president. The president does have the right to issue executive orders. But if those orders don't align with what's already legislated and what's already on the books as far as bills have been passed and legislation or is lawful, then the Congress could actually do something about that. But more importantly, the court could do something about that. So when we look at this, I want to make sure that we are very clear that there was an executive order that was issued by President Donald Trump on January 20th, 2025. He issued executive order number 14160 titled Protecting the Meaning and Value of American Citizenship. You can even go to, if you want to see it, you can go to the White House website and you can pull it up on www.whitehouse.gov. This was, and it goes into the whole list of this executive order of what the president was trying to do. And his argument in this executive order, I'm reading exactly from the White House's webpage, where they say, but the 14th Amendment has never been interpreted to extend citizenship universally to everyone born within the United States. Now, obviously, that is a contradiction. That's clearly a contradiction to what we just read. The U.S. Constitution, when we look at the 14th Amendment, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So clearly, this executive order is a contradiction to what we just read. But the 14th Amendment, this is what they're saying, the 14th Amendment has never been interpreted to extend citizenship universally to everyone born in the United States. That is a lie. I want to make sure that we're very clear about that. That is a lie. Because there is no other court case that has come to the Supreme Court where the Supreme Court has ruled that all persons born in the United States are not U.S. citizens. Okay, with the exception of the children of foreign diplomats. But there's also legislation that says, okay, that is a specific group, because those who are children born here of foreign diplomats have a different type of immunity. Like you talk about diplomatic immunity, they are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Okay, that's why if you go to an embassy, say of another country, while they are at that embassy, they are essentially on what we would call foreign soil. Foreign diplomats, that's different. That is the only exception. Okay, when it comes to everybody else. So if you have just your, random person who comes here from wherever it may be, whether they came from Canada, whether they came from Mexico, whether they came from South Africa, whether they came from China, doesn't matter, came from Egypt, doesn't matter where this person came from. If they come here and they give birth to a child in any of the United States, places in the United States, any state, that child is a U.S. citizen, because the Supreme Court has never ruled otherwise. Never ruled otherwise. And I don't want to go back into the case that was litigated a long time ago, but I guess maybe we should, to make sure that people understand what has already been decided. I want to make sure that we have that. So for those who may not know, I want you to make sure you go back and take a look at this. All right. So in the 1890s, the Supreme Court ruled about birthright citizenship in United States v. Wong Kim Ark in 1898. The court ruled that under the 14th Amendment, anyone born on U.S. soil is an American citizen, regardless of their parents' foreign nationality. Okay, because in this case, Wong Kim Ark, he was a man born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrants. And when he returned from a temporary trip to China, the U.S. government denied him re-entry, arguing that his Chinese parents prevented him from being an American citizen. And we have to understand that in a 6-2 decision, the Supreme Court sided with Wong, and the court explained that under the concept of jus soli, that's Latin for right of the soil, birth on U.S. land automatically makes a person a citizen, provided they are not the children of foreign diplomats. All right. So when we think about this, in 1898, there was already a case that had come before the Supreme Court about birthright citizenship. So it's not like this hadn't already been decided more than 100 years ago. 1898, the case came before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled on birthright citizenship that under the 14th Amendment, anyone born on U.S. soil is an American citizen, regardless of their parents' nationality, with the exception of those born of a foreign diplomat. So why are we even having this conversation? All right. Why are we even having this conversation? This should have been a settled issue. And for most of the 20th century, all of the 20th century, and up to now, right, this had been the accepted law of the land, and no one challenged it until last year on January 20th, 2025, with the executive order that came out. Okay. So we have to think about this. This in the case, when we look at this, is this case of birthright citizenship. I want to make sure that we have the correct terminology for you. All right. So what happened here? What exactly is it that this case we need to pay close attention to? Because based on what we saw in the case from 1898, this should have been a relatively easy call. The 14th Amendment is pretty clear. I mean, it's for those who are not lawyers like myself, it's easy to figure out, like, all persons born, they're citizens here. They're born on U.S. soil, they're citizens here. So the 14th Amendment says it pretty clearly, I think. And we have the case from 1898 that also reaffirms what we read in the 14th Amendment. So the question becomes, why was the decision so close? Why was the decision so close where, yes, it was a 6-3 ruling? Well, kind of, sort of. And I think it's important for us to know that, yes, there was a ruling about this. So who all actually held that people born here in the United States are citizens? So let's look at this for a minute. In the actual ruling, and I encourage you, it's 194 pages. Most of it, about 2/3 of it, or more than 2/3 of it, is actually the dissenting opinion. But we won't get into all of that today. Most of it is about what they disagree with. So let's just get down to what was said. So the court held that children, and I'm reading exactly from their decision, children born in the United States to parents unlawfully or temporarily present are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and are citizens at birth under the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause. That is very important for us to make sure that there's no question about it. Children born in the United States to parents unlawfully or temporarily present are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Now, someone might want to argue, well, how can you say that? And it's very simple. People that are here in the country, are they allowed to just break laws while they're here? If someone enters the country unlawfully, let's say this person's undocumented, they enter the country unlawfully. If they break the law while they're in the country, they are subject to the jurisdiction of the country, because it's not like someone can just shoot someone in the middle of the street and then say, well, I'm not a citizen, and nothing happens. That's not the way it works. You can't be someone in our country who, with the exception of a foreign diplomat, okay, you can't be someone in the country who is walking down the street and just say, I'm going to stab someone, and nothing happens. If you commit a crime here, whether you are documented or not, whether you are a citizen or not, if you commit a crime, then law enforcement will arrest you and you will face consequences. You can be held guilty by a jury of your peers for committing a crime. So if that is the case, that means you're subject to the jurisdiction of the country. You're subject to the jurisdiction of the state that you're in. And if you commit a federal crime, you're subject to being prosecuted by the U.S. District Attorney's Office. I mean, let's just be real. It's not like you can just be here undocumented and you don't have to follow any traffic laws. You don't have to follow any criminal law. You don't have to do anything. You can just do whatever you want to do. That's not the way it works. So I'm glad that the Supreme Court was very clear about children born in the United States to parents unlawfully or temporarily present are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and are citizens at birth under the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause. Okay, now there's a lot of historical context that we could get into that they talk about, but it really shouldn't take all of that. Now, some might want to argue, and in the dissenting opinion, in Justice Clarence Thomas, he certainly tried his best to try to say that the 14th Amendment was about only black slaves who had been freed, and that's not what it reads. At least when I read the 14th Amendment, it doesn't say all black people born or naturalized in the United States. That's not what it says. All people who were formerly slaves born in the United States. That's not what it says. It says all persons born or naturalized in the United States. It is a general, very universal term, all persons, so that it puts to rest who is included. Doesn't matter. It doesn't talk about whether you're from an African nation or from a Latin American nation, or Latin nation. We're not talking about someone who may be from because Latin America, I think sometimes I want to make sure that we're clear about this. Sometimes people think Latin America, they say America. Well, yes, there is North and South America, Central America. Okay, America is not the United States. America includes all of the countries in the North or the South or in Central America. So just want to make sure we're clear about that. So wherever people are from, it doesn't matter, because the 14th Amendment doesn't discriminate. That's really important. And that's what the court is trying to help us understand, that the 14th Amendment doesn't discriminate. It is for everyone who's born here, and that makes it very easy. Now, some people may not like that's the way it is, and certainly Congress can pass legislation to make it more restrictive. They can. I don't know if that's necessarily going to be politically a good move, but Congress can attempt to do that if it so chooses. But no one has challenged it for more than 125 years. Okay, no one has challenged that until last year. And the Supreme Court held like, no, the 14th Amendment is what it is, and we're not going to change it. And I'm glad that that happened. I'm glad that we didn't have an issue where we're trying to change something that should have been settled. When we start talking about constitutional amendments, we shouldn't be trying to change things unless something is broken. And the reality is that when it comes to people being born here and being citizens, that's not a broken system. Now, some may try to exploit that system. And if you want to talk about different types of immigration pathways or immigration restrictions and things like that, the country does have the right to say, okay, we're going to restrict the amount of people that can come here. But it shouldn't be based on where they're from or their skin tone. It shouldn't be that case. But every country as a sovereign nation has a right to say, okay, these are the amount of resources that we have, and this is what's going to work for us, and we can only do so much. And there are laws that Congress can pass those laws to make those changes. So it's not outside the realm of Congress making some adjustments if it so chooses, but it wouldn't be popular politically. More than likely, it wouldn't be popular, and I don't know who would be the ones that would want to bring that forward. I would say this, and if we're to be honest, the likelihood of that coming forward from a Democratic representative or senator is highly unlikely. Highly unlikely, given the party's base. It's just probably not going to happen. Could it happen from a Republican representative or senator? Possibly, but even then, it's still not the most popular politically thing to do. So you really have to think about that. The executive order that was issued, obviously, the court has struck that down, but they did give some suggestions on how they might get some success in the future if someone wanted to bring that back around, which is another story for another day. But the point that I wanted to make out of all of this is that we have to pay close attention to, there are things going on in our country where we are having to deal with issues that honestly they should have been settled, and they were settled. They were settled already. This was settled back in 1898. Why are we coming back around in 2026 having a conversation about who is a U.S. citizen when that was already established more than 125 years ago? Why are we having that conversation today? I think we have to think about this even more moving forward as we get closer to the midterm elections. What are the things that are trying to be rolled back? What are the things that are trying to be rolled back? And some people might look at the 14th Amendment as this pesky amendment where it allows for everyone born here to be considered citizens. And then we start running into some issues that we've seen recently about due process of law. Notice how it says, and I want to just, as we probably talk about this more next time, no state shall make or offense or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor to deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. Now, the reason why I'm just bringing this up right now is because any state, any person, any state, any person, I want you to think about that. When we start talking more about the equal protection under the law, we start talking about due process. It didn't say any citizen, it said any person. And if it means any person, because we got to make sure in the actual text, it first starts out talking about that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. But it didn't stop there. It says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So does that apply to undocumented people? Based on the text, it appears that is the case. So we have to think about what the law actually says, what the amendment says, and how are we enforcing those laws? Are we interpreting these things correctly? And that's where there becomes arguments for due process. When we look at all of these retention centers around the country right now and ICE and all of those things, that becomes a conversation that will make its way into the courtrooms, which it has already. So we're going to stop right there because that's a lot of good information to dive into. I encourage you to go back, read the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, specifically Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. That's where you will find that. If you want to read the executive order from last year, you can find that on the White House's page, executive order right there, 14160. And if you want to read the Supreme Court's decision about that executive order, you can go to the Supreme Court site and they will have all of the opinions there. I encourage you to stay informed, to stay engaged in what's happening from the political landscape. We can always talk about the reasons why this is happening and all of those things, and that is a different conversation. But we must first start with just the actual facts themselves. Go back, and if you want to, also read about the case from 1898 that already settled this issue. Read the facts. I encourage all of us to please, please, please know the history of what happened so that then you have proper context when you are reading these cases. And there's a lot of historical information in these opinions that will help. I think Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson did a tremendous job of providing historical context about how do we get to the 14th Amendment anyway. And now when we read the 14th Amendment, understanding that it is a universalist idea. Okay, so I'll let you chew on that for a little bit. Until next time, stay safe out there. Do the best that you can each and every day, and we will connect again soon.